Beneath the busy streets of Edinburgh, sealed in stone and darkness, there is an entire lost street, a row of houses, shops and homes, exactly as they were 350 years ago, buried under the city and, according to legend, sealed up deliberately, with the dying still inside. Edinburgh is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. A castle on a black rock, elegant streets, 1 million tourists a year. But it is also, by reputation, one of the most haunted places on the entire planet. And underneath the beauty lies a history so dark it is almost hard to believe. This is a city that burned hundreds of people as witches on its castle esplanade. A city where a respected gentleman confessed out of nowhere to a lifetime of witchcraft and was strangled and burned for it. A city where 2 men murdered 16 people and sold the bodies. And a city that holds what has been called the most dangerous haunting in Britain. A tomb where visitors are still, to this day, scratched, bruised, burned and knocked unconscious by something no one can see. Before we go down into the dark, do one quick thing. If you love this kind of true, dark history, hit that subscribe button now. It's completely free, it genuinely helps the channel grow, and it means you'll never miss a journey like this one. Go on, subscribe, and let's step into the shadows of Edinburgh. And we begin with that lost street beneath the city, because it is the darkest secret of all. Its name is Mary King's Close. In the 17th century, this was a steep, narrow lane crammed with tall tenements, a bustling, filthy, overcrowded street packed with families, tradesmen and merchants, all living stacked on top of one another in the heart of the old city. And then in 1645, the plague came to Edinburgh. It tore through the cramped closes of the old town with horrifying speed, killing on a massive scale, perhaps a quarter or more of the entire city. Because in these tight, airless lanes, where whole families shared a single room and neighbours shared a single stair, the disease leapt from person to person before anyone could be isolated. And the darkest legend of Mary King's Close is this: that the authorities, desperate to stop the spread, simply sealed the plague-ridden close off, bricking up the sick and the dying in seaside, and leaving them to perish in the dark. Later, the ruined street was built over, entombed beneath the buildings of the growing city, and forgotten. Today you can go down into it. Walk those cold, silent underground lanes into the actual rooms where people lived and died. And in one small room, visitors for years have left gifts. Toys, coins, trinkets, for the ghost of a little girl called Annie, a child said to have died there of the plague, abandoned and alone, whose small sad presence people claim to feel to this day. The plague was one way Edinburgh killed its own, but the city reserved a special cruelty for those it feared, and for a very long time, what it feared most was witches. Look north from the old town today, and you see the beautiful green sweep of Prince's Street Gardens. But for centuries, this was not a garden at all. It was a lake, the Nor Loch, a foul, stagnant body of water that served as the city's open sewer and its northern defence. And it served one more purpose, darker than either. When Edinburgh accused a woman of witchcraft, this loch was where they brought her for the ordeal. They would bind her, often thumb to opposite toe, and throw her into the black water to be judged. If she sank and drowned, she was declared innocent. If she floated, she was guilty and was hauled back out to be executed. It was a test no one could truly win. And when the burnings were done up on the castle esplanade, where, over the years of the witch panic, hundreds of people, mostly women, were strangled and burned to death on the hill in front of the castle, the bodies were sometimes simply flung over the wall and down into the waters of the Nor Loch below. A pretty park today, laid over a lake of sewage, witches, and the dead executions were public theatre in old Edinburgh, and no place staged them more often than the Grassmarket in the shadow of the castle. But one execution there went so wrong it became a legend. In 1724, a young fishwife named Maggie Dixon was condemned to hang. Her crime was concealing a pregnancy, a child born and lost outside of marriage, and for that she was sentenced to death. She was brought to the gallows in the Grassmarket, hanged before the usual jeering crowd, pronounced dead by the authorities, cut down, placed in a coffin, and carted off for burial. And then, on the road out of the city, the mourners heard a noise from inside the coffin. Maggie Dickson was not dead. She had survived her own hanging. She sat up, alive, to the astonishment and terror of everyone watching. And here the law delivered a strange mercy. Because she had been legally hanged and pronounced dead, she could not be executed a second time for the same crime. Maggie Dickson walked free. She lived for decades more and went down in Edinburgh legend forever as Half-Hangit Maggie. The woman who came back from the dead on the gallows, Maggie survived the rope. But Edinburgh had a second machine of death, one even more feared, and you can still see it today. It was called the Maiden. Long before the French Revolution made the guillotine famous, Edinburgh was already using a tall, sliding blade to take the heads of the condemned. The Maiden was a heavy iron blade set in a wooden frame, and for a century and a half it stood at the city's execution sites, dropping to sever the heads of criminals, and, more chillingly, of the powerful, nobles, lords, and political enemies who had fallen from grace. In one of history's grim ironies, one of the men who helped introduce the Maiden to Scotland, the Regent Morton, later lost his own head to the very machine he had championed. Around 150 people were beheaded by it. The blade survives still, on display in a museum in the city. The same iron edge that ended so many lives, sitting silent behind glass, and the heads and the bodies were the property of a building that was the black heart of old Edinburgh, the old toll booth. This grim prison and place of executions stood in the middle of the Royal Mile, a fortress of misery where prisoners awaited death, and the severed heads of traitors were spiked above the door for all to see. It was so hated that when it was finally torn down, the people were glad to see it go. Today its outline is marked in the cobbles by a mosaic in the shape of a heart, the heart of Midlothian. And to this day, locals passing by will stop and spit on it, a strange old tradition born of pure contempt for the place of death that once stood there. And death did not spare even the Palace of Kings. For one of the most notorious murders in Scottish history happened not in a slum or a prison, but in the private chambers of a queen. In 1566, inside the palace of Holyrood House at the foot of the Royal Mile, the young and pregnant Mary, Queen of Scots, was at supper with her closest companions, among them her Italian secretary and favourite, David Rizzio. Suddenly, a group of armed conspirators, led by Mary's own jealous husband, Lord Darnley, burst into the room. They seized the terrified Rizzio, dragged him screaming away from the Queen, who tried to shield him, and stabbed him. Again and again, more than 50 times, as Mary watched, a loaded pistol reportedly held against her swollen belly. They left his mutilated body at the top of the stairs. And to this day, guides at Holyrood will show visitors a dark stain on the floorboards near that spot and tell them in a hushed voice that it is the blood of David Rizzio, a stain that, the legend says, has never fully washed away in over 400 years. But Edinburgh's most shocking case of everyday evil came from a man no one ever suspected, a pillar of the community who unmasked himself. His name was Major Thomas Weir, and he lived on the West Bow, a steep street in the old town. Weir was, to all appearances, the most respectable man imaginable, a stern, devout, war-hardened Presbyterian, famous across the city for the power and holiness of his prayers, a captain of the town guard, always dressed in black, always carrying a strange staff carved with the heads of satyrs. People revered him, and then in 1670, at the age of 70, something in Thomas Weir broke. Before a gathered crowd who expected another of his famous prayers, he suddenly began instead to confess. He confessed to a secret life of appalling crimes, to witchcraft, to a pact with the devil himself, to unspeakable acts with his own sister. At first, the authorities refused to believe him. They thought the old man had simply lost his mind. But he insisted again and again until they had no choice but to try him. He was convicted, strangled, and burned, and his infamous staff, the one carved with demons, was said to have been thrown into the fire with him, where witnesses swore it writhed and twisted like a living thing. His house on the West Bow stood empty and shunned for a century, believed to be so cursed that no one dared live in it. The Wizard of the West Bow, the holy man who was secretly damned. Edinburgh was full of these double lives, respectable by day, monstrous by night. And the most famous of them all inspired one of the greatest horror stories ever written. Meet Deacon William Brodie. By day, he was one of the most trusted men in Edinburgh, a skilled cabinet maker, a member of the town council, a respectable gentleman who moved in the finest circles of society. But Brodie had a secret. By day he made and fitted the locks and cabinets of the city's wealthy homes. And by night, using copies of their keys that he had secretly made, he broke into those very same houses and robbed them blind. For years he lived this perfect double life, funding his gambling and his secret second family through burglary, while the whole city trusted him completely. It all came crashing down at last, and in 1788 Deacon Brodie was hanged, reputedly on a gallows of a new design that he himself had helped to fund. And decades later, a young Edinburgh writer named Robert Louis Stevenson, who had grown up hearing the story of the respectable man with the monstrous secret, turned Deacon Brodie into one of the most famous tales in the English language, the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But no double life in Edinburgh was darker than the trade that flourished in the shadow of its great medical school. A trade in fresh corpses, and then in murder. In the early 19th century, Edinburgh was one of the greatest centres of medical learning in the world, and its anatomy teachers needed a constant supply of dead bodies to dissect for their students. The law could not provide nearly enough, and so a black market rose to meet the demand. The resurrection men, who crept into the city's graveyards at night to dig up the freshly buried dead and sell them to the anatomists. It became so bad that grieving families stood guard over new graves and built iron cages, called mortises, over their loved ones to stop the body-snatchers. And then two men found a shortcut more terrible than grave robbing. Their names were William Burke and William Hare. Rather than dig up the dead, they simply created them. Over about 10 months in 1828, Burke and Hare murdered 16 people. Luring the poor, the lonely, and the vulnerable into their lodging house, plying them with drink, and then suffocating them, a method so quiet and specific it's still called burking today. And each fresh, undamaged body they carried straight to the anatomy rooms of the celebrated Dr. Robert Knox, who paid them well and asked no questions. When they were finally caught, Hare betrayed Burke to save himself. Burke was hanged before a huge crowd. And then, in a fitting and grisly justice, his body was publicly dissected, exactly as his victims had been. His skeleton is still on display in Edinburgh to this day. Dr. Knox, the man whose demand had driven the whole slaughter, was never charged, but the city never forgave him. And Burke and Hare may have left behind one last, haunting mystery, one that has never been solved. Because in 1836, a group of boys hunting for rabbits on the slopes of Arthur's Seat, the great hill above the city, stumbled on a small opening in the rocks. Inside, arranged in careful rows, they found 17 tiny wooden coffins, each just a few inches long, and each containing a little carved wooden figure, dressed in hand-stitched clothes. 17 miniature burials, hidden on the mountainside by someone, for reasons no one has ever explained. And here is the chilling coincidence. Burke and Hare had murdered around 17 people. Many believe the coffins were a secret act of guilt or ritual, a burial for victims who never received a real one, whose bodies had ended up on the dissection table instead of in the ground. Others think witchcraft or something stranger. No one knows. 8 of those eerie little coffins survive in a museum in Edinburgh to this day, still guarding their secret. The poorest people Burke and Hare preyed upon often lived in a place that was already a kind of hell on earth. The hidden vaults beneath the city's bridges. When Edinburgh built the Great South Bridge in the 1780s, it was constructed on a series of tall stone arches, and inside those arches, hidden beneath the roadway, were dozens of dark windowless chambers known as the Edinburgh Vaults. At first they were used for storage and workshops, but as the years passed and the damp crept in, The respectable trades abandoned them, and the vaults sank into darkness. They became the refuge of the poorest and most desperate people in the city, the homeless, criminals, illicit whiskey distillers. And according to the grim legends, the body-snatchers, who are said to have stored their stolen and murdered dead down here in the black. Whole families lived crammed in these lightless, airless stone boxes beneath the feet of the city, in conditions almost impossible to imagine, until eventually even they were cleared out, and the vaults were filled with rubble and forgotten for over a century. When they were rediscovered and reopened in modern times, they gained a new and sinister reputation. The Edinburgh vaults have been named by some as the most haunted place in all of Britain. A lightless underworld where visitors report being touched, followed, watched, and menaced by presences in the dark that have never left. One chamber is said to be stalked by a menacing spirit the guides call Mr. Boots, a tall, angry male presence that looms over visitors and fills the room with dread. In another vault, ghost hunters discovered a ring of stones laid out in a circle, believed to be the remains of a witch's coven that once used these hidden chambers, far from the eyes of the authorities, to work their rituals in the dark. People go down into the vaults today for a thrill, and a surprising number come back up shaken, pale, and unwilling to say exactly what they felt. Brush past them in the black. The vaults are not the only mystery hidden beneath Edinburgh. On the city's southern edge lies another underground riddle that no one has ever solved, Gilmerton Cove. It is a network of hand-carved passages and chambers cut deep into solid sandstone, rooms with stone benches, tables and seats, all hewn out of the living rock by human hands. And the mystery is simple. Nobody knows who made it, or why. The official story credits a local blacksmith in the 1720s, said to have dug it out as his home. But the sheer scale and strangeness of the place has fueled far darker theories for centuries. That it was a secret drinking den for a scandalous hellfire club of the gentry, a hideout for smugglers, a refuge for persecuted Covenanters, or something older and stranger still, its true origin lost entirely to time. People descend into it today and walk through those silent, cold, carved rooms and feel the weight of a secret that has never been given up. An entire underground world beneath a quiet suburb, and no one alive who can say what it was truly for. And these underground passages are tied to one of Edinburgh's eeriest legends of all, the story of the Lost Piper. It's said that long ago, when tunnels were discovered running beneath the old town from the castle, a young piper was sent down to explore them and map where they led. To let those above follow his progress, he played his pipes as he walked, the sound drifting up through the ground beneath the streets. The crowd followed the music along the Royal Mile, until about halfway down the piping suddenly stopped. It simply cut off mid-tune. Rescuers went down after him, but the boy was never found. He had vanished into the dark beneath the city, and no trace of him ever came to light. And to this day, they say, on the quietest nights, people standing on certain spots along the Royal Mile have heard it. The faint, distant sound of bagpipes, still playing, somewhere down in the tunnels, far below their feet. The lost piper of Edinburgh, still walking the dark, still searching for the way out. And so we come at last to the darkest place in all of Edinburgh, a graveyard with a reputation so violent that people have signed waivers to enter it and left needing medical attention. This is the final and most terrifying secret of the city. It is called Greyfriars Kirkyard, an ancient burial ground in the heart of the old town. By day it is a peaceful, atmospheric place of leaning gravestones and old tombs. But it holds two of the darkest chapters in Scottish history, bound together in one cursed corner. In the 17th century, a lawyer named Sir George Mackenzie became the ruthless persecutor of the Covenanters, Presbyterians who refused to bend their faith to the king. He hunted them, tried them, and sent so many to torture and death that he earned a name that has never left him. Bloody Mackenzie. And in 1679, after a great defeat, over 1,000 Covenanter prisoners were herded into a corner of this very graveyard. an open-air field known ever since as the Covenanters' Prison, and held there through the brutal winter with almost no food or shelter. Most of them died of starvation, exposure, and cruelty. It has been called one of the world's first concentration camps. And here is the terrible irony that lies at the black heart of Greyfriars. For buried in a great domed tomb, the Black Mausoleum, just yards from the prison where his victims died, lies Bloody Mackenzie himself. For centuries, the two rested uneasily side by side. And then, in 1999, something woke up. A homeless man, sheltering from the cold, broke into Mackenzie's Black Mausoleum and disturbed the tomb. And from that moment, the attacks began. Visitors to the Covenanters' Prison and the Mausoleum started reporting something unheard of. Not just cold spots or shadows, but violence. People have been scratched and cut, often in deep parallel lines. They've been bruised, burned, and bitten, sometimes under their clothing where no hand could reach. Some have been knocked to the ground or found unconscious. Hundreds upon hundreds of these attacks have now been documented, more than almost any other haunting in the world, blamed on what has become known as the Mackenzie poltergeist, the enraged spirit of Bloody Mackenzie, still lashing out from his tomb in the very ground where his victims were left to die. The city keeps that corner of Greyfriars locked, and people who go in on the tours still come out, now and then, with fresh scratches they cannot explain. And that is Edinburgh. The real Edinburgh beneath the castle and the postcards. A city built over a sealed street of the plague dead, a lake of drowned witches turned into a garden, a holy man who was secretly a monster, a respectable councillor who was secretly a thief, and two killers who turned murder into a business, a hidden underworld of vaults, and a graveyard so angry it still draws blood. The beauty is real, but so is everything underneath it. If you enjoyed this walk through the dark side of Edinburgh, subscribe, and we'll take you into the shadows of another of Britain's cities very soon. Because in a place this old and this beautiful, the past is never really dead. In Edinburgh, it's just waiting beneath your feet.